Welcome everyone to our fourth colloquium on effective and responsible innovation. Today's speaker is Nirav Desai, and he is the CEO of a startup company called Moonbeam that's focused on negotiating efficiency in corporate innovation. He has a long history of helping corporate venture funds and innovation groups find and adapt next generation technology, as well as helping startups sell enterprise. It's our great pleasure to welcome him today in ECE, and we look forward to hearing more about genius clusters and the many nuances that are involved in commercialization of technology. So with that, I will turn it over to Nirav. If you do have questions during the colloquium, please feel free to post them on chat, or you can unmute yourselves at the end of the presentation or during pauses to ask questions. We welcome any and all questions. And with that, Nirav, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Denise, and thank you for setting this up and inviting me to be a speaker here, as well to Shruti and to Emily for helping run things. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you, virtually speak to all of you. A little bit on the presentation. I've structured it with two question and answer sessions, so please add questions to the chat. I'll kind of two parts. One is a kind of a historical analysis, then I'll go into predictions for the future, or looking at how data is leading the future. And I'll stop in between to kind of talk through any questions or any more detail you may have. Second, I want to caveat this. This is a qualitative, not a quantitative assessment. There is some numbers behind this, but a lot of this is coming from interviews I've done with various trade and investor organizations. It's not comprehensive across the whole world. So please bear that in mind. I've done my best to represent different parts of the world, but it's by no means comprehensive. So with that, I would love to talk to you about genius clusters. I'm borrowing this term from Eric Weiner, who wrote The Geography of Genius, and really looking into what brings world-changing innovations together to implement the future. So with that, let's just jump into it. Question one is, was there a greatest pitch of all time? And my argument is that there actually was, and it actually comes down to a question between two. And this is not Facebook, this is not Google, goes quite a bit further back. We're looking at the pitch that Christopher Columbus made to the monarchs of Spain around the venture to sail west to get to India. And then a few years later, Vasco da Gama made a similar pitch to the King of Portugal. And these are actually the locations where those pitches were made. What's interesting is that these two examples demonstrate two very different kinds of innovation. Christopher Columbus, kind of partially out of necessity, this was a transformative innovation, right? Actually, let me start with da Gama, because I'll explain adjacent and then I'll go over transformative. So da Gama was building off the work of prior explorers, sailing down the African coast, sailing Bartholomew Diaz when it went past the Cape of Good Hope. And so his pitch was not that much of a big leap. And you could make that argument towards incremental or adjacent innovation. We're trying to go a little bit further. Christopher Columbus's, though, was transformational, right? Let's change the whole direction that we're heading and strike off in this new location. I'm not to say which one's better or which one's worse, but the changes that caused transformed this world in a way that we has affected everything that we see. Now, let me go a little bit further down the history. So actually, before I get into more history, let me talk a little bit about Moonbeam and why I'm presenting this in such a grand historical way. Moonbeam has been built a business around advising governments, corporations, and economic development committees around how to tap into innovation ecosystems around the world. We built an innovation index, which really takes a lot of data sources: government spend, venture capital data, university R&D, growth trends, workforce metrics, to help identify what are the emerging tech clusters, where they're coming from, what technologies to track, where to engage, and how to best maximize use of R&D dollars. I don't need to go through the details of this, but we have a process around this. I've been consulting a number of different agencies, and a lot of what you're going to be hearing is coming out of those conversations. And so, jumping into the geography of genius, it took and this is again pulling from Eric Wiener's wonderful book. When you think of genius clusters, historically, the great context for four that really popped in mind, and I've highlighted, we often think about innovation as the entrepreneur. And I liken it to the great man history perspective. So we think about Florence, and when we think of Florence, we think of Leonardo da Vinci, the Italian Renaissance. When we think about Scottish Enlightenment, it's really Newton. When we think about the Bengali Renaissance, it's Tagore, and when we think of around Silicon Valley, it's Jobs and Wozniak. I want to highlight, though, that there's a whole ecosystem here that goes to creating this. It is inventors talking to painters, talking to sculptors, talking to architects, or it's William Shockley taking what he learned from Bell Labs and working with Bob Noyce to set up and invest in Intel. That create and that the lessons from Intel informing Jobs and Wozniak and what they did to start Apple, these inform each other. And if you look at Bose talking to Roy, and the political reform coupled with the scientific reform in Calcutta created that ecosystem for ideas to be bounced off each other. This is a genius cluster. And we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about how we're bringing together academia, industry, and innovators to create the next economy. So what are the three components that make a successful genius cluster? It's kind of like a three-legged stool that relies on a few things: resources, talent, and investment. And that those come together to create a capability market fit. And there's a lot of elements that go into that. Resources that consist of trade networks, resources. You know, this is what makes your location specific. What's there? Talent is really about how you can attract the best and the brightest to build in that location. And investment need not be local, right? If do you have access to investment? Going back to the example, you know, Columbus had to go talk to many different European monarchs before the Spanish agreed to fund him. He went to Portugal first; they refused. Whereas Da Gama had access to capital right in his backyard. So these kind of considerations go into account. But what's slightly underrepresented is the bottom section, which is government. Government actually really sets the conditions for innovation. They're able to create a culture or create an environment which encourages risk taking. But they also, and I think what's often underrepresented when we talk about narratives around innovation, is they often provide funding and initial customers. So a few use cases on this is, let's look at Google. Google we think of as being not really being built off government. I mean, we all know about the government investment in creating the internet and all that, but very specifically the work, the core tech that Google was based on, the idea of the massively parallelized search, came out of the DARPA Digital Libraries initiative. That same grant actually went out to create what some of you may remember, likely not, but is Lycos, a prior search engine. And these these core innovations quickly got commercialized at the dawn of the internet and created two of the major search engines. Apple, another company that we don't often associate with government, got its initial start actually on an SBA loan. That helped them get off the ground, but what was really groundbreaking for them is their first major customer was California Department of Education. That's what really helped establish them as a lasting company before they can really take on the private sector. So they built their whole ethos around education. They got a lot of contract funding from the government, and that helped create the conditions that created Apple. So quick history on some, the next section, I'm going to go through a few different models of innovation economies, these genius clusters. And the most obvious one, of course, we always start with the Silicon Valley. And I actually like to divide Silicon Valley into two different waves. There was the early wave around hardware. That was Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild, Intel, et cetera. This kind of set the hardware standard for computing. And then there's the later ecosystem, which really is cloud. I include internet and cloud. It was homegrown innovation with a lot of early government spend. A lot of it came out of government R&D on for the space race. If you want to read a good book on this, read The Code by Margaret O'Mara, another UW professor. Highly recommend it. She goes into the detail of really how the value was built coming out of the space race. But we have things like, you have your talent attraction through Stanford and Berkeley. The good weather helped a lot. People easily want to go to live in California. But then you have investments from space race, corporate innovation labs. Xerox, a New York-based company, opened up Park in Palo Alto. What's interesting is what they were lacking, though, was a local economy. Prior to Silicon Valley, it was really just farmland. The entrepreneurs had to search. They had to be hungry. They had to. They could sell to the DoD locally, somewhat locally, but more often they had to travel to find clients. I counter that with the next example, which is Houston. And why is Houston not Silicon Valley? And it's an odd question to ask in this day and age. But when you go back in history, Kennedy actually made the announcement about going to the moon. The challenge was made at Rice University. Johnson Space Center was established with the most critical part of spaceflight, which was human spaceflight, as their core mandate. They got the plurality of NASA R&D money. Why did Houston not become Silicon Valley? They had talent with Rice University, University of Texas Medical Branch being a major draw for research dollars. And they had a great corporate innovation and headquarters, the decision makers with the energy sector right there. And they had all the cost of living, great ports. Yet a lot of their technology was funneled directly into oil and gas. They didn't have to search for clients. They weren't as hungry as, say, Silicon Valley was. Now, there's other questions, and I want you guys to ponder this a little bit. What do civic leaders do to define a vision, to help entrepreneurs execute that vision? In light of, and I would love to entertain questions on this, but let me go through a few more examples. Now we're going to Austin. There's another model, which Austin has kind of been the cheerleader for, and a really great success story, which is a back office outsourcing model. Nearly every major Silicon Valley corporation has a back office in Austin at this point. It's really started in the mid-90s with South by Southwest being a major media piece. the city getting around it, and they sold talent, they sold culture, they sold cost of living. Through that, they were able to attract investment. Austin actually gets more investment dollars than San Francisco, than Seattle. Number two after Silicon Valley in terms of private VC funding. They had a very small local economy at that point. Really, entrepreneurs in Austin would have to sell to Houston or Dallas or outside. This is a model that's has made Austin one of the fastest growing cities in the country. But a question I will ask is, think about how many companies you can name from Austin. Dublin and Lisbon internationally have taken this model, and you see a lot of corporate back offices being built in Dublin. Lisbon's starting to attract some of that right now. Model number three, maybe four, is Seattle. This is the invent and scale model. So here it's similar to what San Francisco went through, I would say a little bit further behind, with a main focus on inventing locally and then scaling that globally. Again, from a talent perspective, University of Washington, it's a strong cultural capital, particularly in the early 90s with Seattle being on the map. Made attracted a lot of interest in people trying out Seattle, going, visiting it, deciding to stay, etc. The interesting thing about Seattle is really the risk-taking corporations that we have here, which led to easy adopting. And you think about Seattle, it's really an enterprise innovation town, and that really comes from the risk-taking corporations that are willing to work with startups. From a resource perspective, there is also a lot of DoD spend. It's more on the contract side, but it's really because it's a diverse economy that influences operations in Seattle. We're not world leading in really any sector except for technology, but prior to Microsoft. But we had a little bit of everything. We had a little bit of healthcare. We have a little bit of logistics, a little bit of aerospace, actually a lot of aerospace. And that led to an interesting collection of companies. The model that this can boast, so Boston's kind of taking on a similar model with a lot more emphasis on early R&D in academia. And Toulouse, France, pivoting around Airbus and the aerospace industry there is comparable. And lastly, this is a largely international model, is Singapore, which has fashioned itself to be the landing pad for companies that want to sell to Asia. It started out very much from a sales first model, attracting talent with talent across Asia to study in Singapore, and really bringing together, selling the idea of being, if you're going to have a corporate headquarters in Asia, have it in Singapore, and you can get access to all of Asia from there. This is a model that's being followed to a certain degree in Dubai, to a larger degree in Malta. And it's really a matter of, it's similar, I would say, to the Austin strategy, but it's more focused on executive leadership, decision makers, locating them in your geography, not so much the back office. These are just a few different models I want you to ponder. And then with that, I'll open up to questions, talk a little bit more about historical models. I'd love to go into more detail about this. I kind of did a quick overview. Denise, Shruti, any questions that we have?
I had a quick question.
Yes.
So you mentioned bad weather being a detractor for building a innovation center in Houston. Mm-hmm. Why is that not at play in Seattle?
Seattle attracts a different crowd in that it's outdoors. It's really about, and again, this is a modern trend, I would say, is being And if you talk to someone like Chris DeVore, who's very influential in the Seattle scene, he advocates that the city should be a playground for technologists. And you know, if you want to attract the best talent, give them a place where they're going to be able to work and have fun. And the outdoorsy nature of Seattle attracts certain type of lifestyle enthusiasts. Whereas Houston has a little bit more of a challenge there, having grown up in Houston.
Well, I can see that without getting into Texas.
Yep.
My other question was about, you mentioned that Seattle doesn't have a central technology focus or a central sector focus. And in the 70s, we certainly did, right? It was Boeing or nothing.
Yep.
And then we kind of evolved into biomedical technology. Is that typical? Do you expect that to be typical, that these cities will evolve into multiple sectors without specializing in any particular sector as they grow stronger and bigger?
So if you look at some of the models, what Seattle did really well is go global and then pivot. And that might just be happenstance, but Boeing was a global brand before, I mean, for many years before Microsoft kind of started being the talked about company in the region. Microsoft had a good 20-year run before Amazon started being the company. It was enough to implant and then pivot. And then you, of course, you have, whereas many, I would say many comparable economies don't specialize and don't pivot or pivot too early. So if you, I would compare this to where Lisbon is right now. They are trying to attract all sorts of back office development, but they're not specializing, say, in a particular vertical. Whereas by comparison, say, Malta is really trying to attract gaming exclusively. Helsinki is trying to attract gaming exclusively.
Interesting. Well, thank you. Other questions?
I actually have a couple of questions
Sure.
as well. In the case of Austin and I think Silicon Valley, you had talked about them having a limited local economy as a negative when it comes to resources. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so and this is going back to the early days of both of these genius clusters, right? So at the time that Silicon Valley was formed, at the time that Intel started, Silicon Valley was not Silicon Valley; it was just farmland. And so while there was Moffett Field and there was government buyers looking at funding R&D projects, the first sales for most of those companies, corporate sales, were not to local companies. Austin, likewise, most of the companies that started there, if you think about Trilogy, or you think about National Instruments, they were not selling locally. They were either, naturally selling to the oil companies in Houston and Dallas, or going global initially. Whereas by comparison, Seattle, often you'll see startups that their first customer are, and I'm jumping forward a little bit in time, but their first customer is their work with Providence Hospital, or they work with Starbucks. They work with Packard, kind of get a initial proof of concept. There's a plus and minus to that. So in certain cases, it makes you hungry, and in certain cases, it's just too much of a lift, too steep a hill to climb. But that's part of why I say the investment need not necessarily be local. It could be something you have to strive for. Any other questions or examples, like models I could go further into? All right. Well, I'll continue on then. So let's start with the economy of tomorrow is not really co-located with the economy of today. So when we think about truly transformational change, you have to not think about the economy as it is now. Silicon Valley wasn't built with what it is now. It was built out of farmland. And so when you were looking at truly transformational technologies, where is that going to take hold, and how is the government going to organize to allow that to take hold? So just a little bit of illustration here. If you look at the Fortune 500 list in the US, you see that there's not really much overlap between the classic innovation labs or innovation ecosystems in the US. We did a comparison of where are the top Fortune 500 companies, and then where are the predominance of corporate innovation labs. And clearly San Francisco is on top for corporate innovation labs. Boston's number 2. New York's really the only one that overlaps here on both lists. And so again, the economy of the future is being built in San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, whereas the economy of the past, represented by large corporations, are in these more legacy or incumbent cities. Now let's look directly on some of the technologies that are being heavily invested in right now. So I profiled 5 that are partially most interesting to me, that I feel are quite transformational. This is not an exhaustive list, but this slide only illustrates U.S. SBIR spends, Small Business Innovative Research Grant spending. So intended to be exemplar, not as all-inclusive, but you notice that there is an increase in spending overall, or increase in number of grants. You have there was a bit of a dip in the 2012, 2013, but you have a tendency to and I don't have this overlaid in the slide, but when you overlay where this is being done, you also see a mirroring of where these grants are awarded, matching those innovation labs here. So California gets the lion's share of it. Boston's number 2, or Massachusetts is number 2. And you see Washington State punching above its weight in terms of SBRs per capita. And that's telling, right? We're embracing innovation in these cities. We're bringing together academia with industry and with government. And that's really where it comes together. A little bit on why I highlighted these particular technologies is, if you're thinking about a transformational change rather than adjacent, I would consider advances in AI are adjacent innovation, whereas quantum computing clearly is upending the complete foundations, going back to Alan Turing, everything around computing. Immersive technology is more a paradigm shift, in that we're just at the cusp right now of seeing the impact of this, in that people are starting to think and manipulate data in 3 dimensions as opposed to 2 dimensions. Nanotechnology and synthetic biology really are more around constructing material, constructing medicines at a core level, and it's great to see that UW's investing so heavily in this space, or synthesizing around this. Nano industrial revolution is kind of a term that I've seen around. And edge computing is really if you think about most AI, it's built on the idea of the cloud, built around the big data. Edge computing takes that and it puts that more similar to the way human intelligence functions, which is we don't walk around with the library all the time. We learn what we learn, and then we deploy it in the field. And edge computing is functionally the foundation to make that possible. Now, I'm greatly brushing over the technical depth of all of these subject areas, but I wanted to just highlight that this is a U.S. spend. What you'll start seeing is that, and as I get to the global spend, these are also some of the technologies that globally are being invested in. So real quick, as I look at this model of innovation clusters, these have kind of naturally occurred. So on the gray here, you'll see a lot of where incumbent industries are, and the round circles are really more around what these different innovation clusters or genius clusters are focused on. So the interesting dynamic at work here is if you are a clean tech or energy expert in the field who's working in Louisiana, you're likely to have to move to San Francisco or Austin to start your company, to get the funding, to get the visibility. When your main customer is going to be back in Texas and Louisiana. So it's an odd model right now where we have to go outside of where you already are to get funding, only to move back or sell back to where you're coming from. Ways to connect these clusters is really going to propel innovation a little bit further. And let's look at this on the global scale. So what I've highlighted here are some of the emerging cities that I think are worth looking at. What you'll not see is a lot of the huge economies, Beijing and Singapore and Seoul clearly, but what you see here are more on how municipalities have positioned to create a global brand. Raleigh, for example, with Epic Games being at their core, one of their biggest businesses, and with their GlaxoSmithKline being there, they're really doubling down around what they have and taking that global. So they're investing in immersive technology in gaming and synthetic biology. Malta, again, historically been a cluster, a tax haven, frankly, but they've attracted a lot of fintech entrepreneurs. They've attracted a lot of gaming from the gambling perspective, and now they're transitioning that in and actually merging the two in a strategic way to get into the immersive gaming space and monetizing that. So they're actually building some of the top virtual worlds out of Malta. And then Helsinki, really, they got hit pretty hard in 2012 with the, or 2008 with the financial crisis, and the purchase of Nokia by Microsoft really hurt the economy, and then the subsequent job cuts dramatically hurt Helsinki. However, in 2015, they had 10% of global IPOs. That was structuring themselves around embracing social gaming, merging that with design and focusing on the consumer in a very unique way that led to that result. Supercell, Rovio, a lot of the, I think Rovio, a lot of the mobile gaming companies that probably come to mind, or some of the top titles, Angry Birds, etc., came out of Helsinki. And so it's interesting to see such a small economy having such a dramatic impact by a strategic focus around doubling down on what they have, connecting that with academic research, and government creating the ecosystem to make that happen. What you see in common across these is that focus on deep tech. you often have investment in platform technology, not necessarily just, I mean, I'd be countering myself with the Helsinki example, but it's not just a business model innovation, but it's a technical innovation as well. And they build global connections. And they start looking globally from the outset. And that's a great example of what Seattle has done, partially from being so far from the rest of the US. We think globally first, often in Seattle, and that's a great advantage. So a quick few takeaways is, number one, I think government matters. Government sets the conditions, but also often invests in core innovations that are going to define the future economy. You have to think globally at the outset, both from the entrepreneur perspective, as a engineer, or as a civic planner. We're competing not against other entities in the US, but we're competing globally. And then you have to create conditions to embrace risk. What you'll notice is, and this is the ethos of the Valley: fail fast, fail often. Because only when you do that you succeed. And in creating that culture of embracing risk and not protecting wealth is key to creating a genius cluster and innovation cluster. So I would love to answer more questions, get into more detail. We don't need to dwell on slides, so I have to go back to any slide as needed. But any questions?
Can start off with a question, actually.
Please.
So you covered, US-based examples and some global examples, and economies and governments work differently in both of those cases. Like US has a pretty capitalistic system versus a lot of these European countries have more, I guess, government involved in structuring how their economy works. And so how do you explain, or what are your thoughts on these differences and how they either drive genius clusters or affect them?
Yeah, I mean, so government is an expedient more than anything, right? They're not gonna, so as I mentioned earlier, I think government has a role of setting a vision and catalyzing development. And I would say that's true across the US and Europe. I can speak less to Asia. But I, to a certain degree, in the R&D space, feel it's a slightly false dichotomy, right? In that there are different mechanisms to get government funding. And the absence of venture capital industry in Europe makes the government have to pick up more of the slack, which can work well at early stage. It's harder on the scaling side, if that makes sense. So you see tremendous technology being developed in the Nordics that often ends up being acquired by US companies and then scaled. Because government's really good at early stage R&D, they haven't quite figured out how to incentivize commercialization. And if you look at even the SBIR program in the US, they struggle with this dramatically. Whereas venture capital is great at commercializing existing technology, but it's really bad at invention.
Yeah, Mike Rhodes here. I've got a question. Thanks for your talk. Can you say more about why venture capital is attracted to these areas? Like what draws? I mean, these genius clusters have kind of all three of these things. you're saying the venture capital is key for commercialization. What is the driver of like where the venture capital goes?
So, it's horizon thinking, right? So I would say venture capital has a 7 to 10 year horizon, right? Their investors need to see a return and the around that time frame. So if you're making an investment in a AI company, you want them to either IPO or get acquired so that you get a return on the exit. A government has a longer, or ideally should have a longer strategy, right? So that the time it takes to achieve science and technology objectives for the U.S. government is, we're talking, 25 to 50 year horizon. And for early research, for early R&D, that really requires that longer term thinking. Whereas, scaling an existing solution, requires shorter term thinking. So if you think about it, even the space program, right? Government had to challenge us to go to the moon. It's only once that core technology has been developed that now private sector can start scaling space travel. And now you're starting to see, private sector step in, and even that is with a lot of government support. Does that explain what you're getting at, Michael? Or your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like they're looking at the other factors that you listed, like the talent and the resources of these particular areas, and they're going to those areas that look good in the 10-year kind of horizon.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I'll just run back to that slide. Eventually. Yeah, so I would say any decision maker is should be going through a calculus here of what of these elements do I need to think about in terms of where I want to invest. So, for example, we just invested in hiring some staff in Lisbon, and that's going through a perspective of what's the talent pool look like? What's the nature of connections I'm going to make? Is it going to be a viable place to grow? And it's going to help me with investment. So bringing all those three together to help decide whether that's the right choice to make.
We have a comment in the chat from Jonathan who said the comparison of the genius entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley to Dante was so interesting. I wonder what the great Italian poet would have to say about the fate of such powerful men with such enormous amount of wealth.
I think they'll probably be in the 9th ring of hell.
Again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. I actually have a question from the talent perspective because we have a lot of talented people here in the audience, students, researchers, and so on. If you're an entrepreneur or an engineer who wants to work in a specific area and make an impact, and this is very abstract, given what you just talked about with the resources, talent, investment, and especially as an entrepreneur, how do I use this framework to make decisions regarding relocating or adding to the existing region that I'm in, or even looking for a job? Like if I graduate from UW and I'm like, hey, I'm interested in working in clean tech and moving that forward, do I have to move to Texas, for example, right? So what does that imply for talent who's interested in a lot of these technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's extreme, like you're going to have access to different access and support to different tools depending on where you are. And clean tech is a great example, right? I would say if you're looking at, Europe is spending a lot more money right now on solar and wind over the US, and China and India are spending a lot as well. I don't know if it's more or less, but there, and is the level of maturity of the technology, right? So I would say 20 years ago, if you were looking to, if you were, your research interest was around solar panels, it would be a tough climb. You were a little bit ahead of market demand. Academia would have been a great place for a while, because the research was still there. And particularly in Europe, the research was quite high. But there wasn't that commercialization mandate as as we're seeing now there is. Does that mean you move to Houston? Probably not. That's not really where, I mean, actually, there is a lot of corporate VCs being spent on clean tech solutions by Houston corporations. To a certain degree, the oil and gas industry has realized that they need to be part of their own self-disruption. So they're actually the biggest investors right now in clean tech. But I think looking at the mixture of, it's a bet, right? You're placing a bet based on your career, based on a number of different factors, and the more information you have, the better. And I would say you don't need to necessarily be tied to one location.
Another question in the chat from Denise, and she asks, could you comment on how some of these regions, perhaps using Seattle as an example, stifle or inhibit certain forms of innovation? Do these regions get focused on certain ways of doing things at the expense of dismissing some great ideas?
It's a good question. I'll try to use Seattle as an example here. I think Seattle has a very enterprise-first mindset. I think that's been adjusted a little bit with the success, I would say, of the gaming sector in Seattle. But if you think about like joining Techstars Seattle, right? If you're starting a company and you apply to join this accelerator, you get into Techstars Seattle. The bulk of the mentors you're going to get are enterprise B2B mentors. That's where the career has been. That's what the experience they've gotten, and that's how they've had their success. As opposed to, I would say, a similar program in LA, which is more a B2C town. And I think that should go into your logic of thinking about where you want to found a company, or where you want to, what accelerator you may want to join. And frankly, you don't have to necessarily move there for long term. You could dip into that ecosystem, get what you want out of it, and then move on. But you're going to have a tougher hill to climb for starting a consumer-based company in Seattle than you would in a place like New York or LA. That might be worth it depending on what you're building. It might not be, depending on your considerations. But it's worth knowing and thinking through. If you conversely, if you want to start Seattle's in a lot of things, so that's not a great example. It's going to be hard to work that. But if you want to start a quantum computing company in Chicago, it's going to be really hard. You don't have access to others who are doing that. You might, you're not going to get the mentors you need. You might not even access resources you need. Just to pick on Chicago for whatever reason.
Lots of people pick on Chicago. Thank you.
You actually have another question as well, from Shishant, who asks, how does the probable use of Bitcoins or alternate solutions impact the development of future technologies on Genius clusters? Will it lead to a paradigm shift?
So, Shashank, is that when you say alternate solutions, are you talking about other currencies, blockchain-based currencies, or yes? Okay, cool. So, truthfully, in this area, I don't know that I intentionally didn't include blockchain as a transformational technology on the list. I think it is from a policy perspective, can be very interesting in that it can decouple a currency from a nation state, which can have a lot of interesting policy impacts. From the cybersecurity perspective, or from the encryption perspective, I've seen a lot of people trying to find solid applications from it, but not much of it catching on. From the currency, it makes sense just to decouple, to take control away from reserve banks. But I've been struggling with this and seeing how this is a truly transformational technology. And I really don't have great answers on that, though I am very interested in space.
Any other questions? Okay, I want to thank our speaker so much for spending time with us today and giving us insight in these different clusters around the world. A very interesting talk. I had not realized that the term Genius cluster was out there. So let's give him a hand. And if you want to hang back after we formally end, please feel free to do so, to talk to our speaker. And his contact information is also provided on this slide if you want to follow up. Okay, we'll give it just a couple minutes for people choose to stay or leave. Nirav, thank you so much.
Thank you.